indicative of what we've been doing. She started wanting to have stuff printed out, and I was like, okay, it's not our problem. We have it 2 months. You want us to ship this kind of stuff? Like, let's do it. Enjoy it. I'm gonna get out of the way.
Call the hearing to order. Good morning. As has been the case for a while, this is a hybrid hearing. We have some members participating remotely in addition to the members who are present, and there are rules for that, so I need to read a statement that sets out those rules before we get going. Members who are joining remotely must be visible on screen for the purposes of identity verification, establishing and maintaining a quorum, participating in the proceeding, and voting. Those members must continue to use the software platform's video function while in attendance, unless they experience connectivity issues or other technical problems that render them unable to participate on camera. If a member experiences technical difficulties, they should contact the committee staff for assistance. Video of members' participation will be broadcast in the room via the television/internet feeds. Members participating remotely must seek recognition verbally, and they are asked to mute their microphones when they are not speaking. Members who are participating remotely are reminded to keep the software platform's video function on the entire time they attend the proceeding. Members may leave and rejoin the proceeding. If members depart for a short while for reasons other than joining a different proceeding, they should leave the video function on. If members will be absent for a significant period or depart to join a different proceeding, they should exit the software platform entirely and then rejoin it if they return. Members may use the software platform's chat feature to communicate with staff regarding technical or logistical support issues only. Finally, I have designated a committee staff member to, if necessary, mute unrecognized members' microphones to cancel any inadvertent background noise that may disrupt the proceeding. Thank you. Good morning. I'd like to welcome our witnesses here today. We have the Honorable Lloyd Austin III, Secretary of Defense, General Mark Milley, Chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff, and General Frank McKenzie, Commander, U.S. Central Command. I want to thank them for the time today as they provide an update on the issues surrounding the end of the U.S. military mission in Afghanistan and our mission going forward, dealing with counterterrorism in South Asia and the continuing mission to try to get as many Afghans and any remaining Americans out of the country. Forward to what I hope will be a very important policy discussion. At the center of our examination of the U.S. military mission in Afghanistan is the desire to learn from our 20-year involvement there. We must have an open and honest analysis of everything that went into that, not just the events of the last year or 6 months. But before getting into that, we should take a moment to recognize the service of the over 800,000 men and women who served in Afghanistan over the last 20 years. More importantly, I would like to remember and honor the 2,461 who made the ultimate sacrifice, along with the over 20,000 who bore the physical wounds of war and those who bear the unseen wounds of war. While we will vigorously debate policy decisions related to the U.S. military mission in Afghanistan, I believe that I speak for the entire committee when we express our gratitude to those and their families who have sacrificed so much over those last 20 years. We owe them a debt that cannot be repaid. I agreed and continue to agree with the decision that was made to end our military presence in Afghanistan. It was the right decision. Our larger mission to help build a government in Afghanistan that could govern effectively and defeat the Taliban had failed. More money and more lost American lives were not going to change that. The events we witnessed in Afghanistan in the wake of the collapse of the Afghan government in August happened primarily because of this reality, because of the fundamental reality that our mission to try to stand up a government in place of the Taliban had failed. That reality is what caused the overwhelming majority of the problems that we faced. There was no easy or safe way to get everyone out of that country we wanted to get out. Yet in the face of that, our military conducted the largest human airlift in history, in coordination with the rest of the interagency and our allies, evacuating over 120,000 people. This evacuation, however, did not come without costs. We lost 13 U.S. service members and dozens of innocent Afghans due to ISIS-K's attack at the Abbey Gate on August 26. There was also a tragic mistake on August 29 when a drone strike killed as many as 10 civilians. Following this mistake, I and others expect to be provided with the results of the timely, comprehensive, and transparent investigation of this tragedy, including accountability measures and any changes to procedures that are deemed necessary. Importantly, our work is not done, as there are more who remain in Afghanistan who would like to leave. And we must work to ensure the interagency has all the tools required and is coordinated to assist those remaining individuals. There are some, going back to the issue of whether or not we should have left Afghanistan, who imagine that there was sort of a middle option, that we could have kept 2,500 troops there in a relatively peaceful and stable environment. I think the way that option has been presented by many of the critics has been fundamentally disingenuous. The option of keeping 2,500 troops in Afghanistan in a peaceful and stable environment did not exist. I have heard many compare this to the troops that we have left in South Korea and Japan. I find that analogy just, well, completely idiotic, if I'm being honest. In South Korea and Japan, we are not under attack. We are there as a deterrent. In Afghanistan, we would have been under attack. And that is the fundamental fact that too many people are forgetting. The peace agreement that was signed by the previous president was based on a requirement that we get all of our troops out by May 1st. That's the only reason that the Taliban had not attacked us in the previous 18 months. Once that expired, once we said, nope, we're staying, they would have been under attack. And this has been the subject of a huge misunderstanding in the last 24 hours that, again, I find very, very disingenuous. People are saying that the president said, nobody offered, no one said that we should keep 2,500 there, when what the president actually said was there was no option on the table to keep 2,500 troops in Afghanistan in a stable environment. That's what he said. Not that no one presented that option. That option didn't exist in reality, and no one presented it. The president, in fact, made it clear earlier in that same interview that, yes, some of his military leaders had said that we should keep 2,500 troops there. What he said was, none of them said that we could do it in a stable, peaceful environment. And that is the key point. The other key point is, and I know a lot of energy will be expended today trying to get these gentlemen to admit that they didn't agree with the president's decision. First of all, I'd never engage in that exercise because I believe the president, Democrat, Republican, no matter who it is, deserves the unabridged advice of his or her commanders. I mean, you can't give that if you're then going to have to go out in public and talk about it. But second of all, the president is the one in charge. This is ultimately what civilian control of the military means. And what I believe is, I believe certainly there were military commanders who said, nope, we should stick it out, we should keep the 2,500 there. I think they were wrong, and so did the president. It's not that they didn't make the advice, it's that they were wrong. This committee has an enormous amount of respect for our military leadership. That does not mean that the military leadership is incapable of being wrong. And over the course of the last 20 years in Afghanistan, I would have thought we would have learned that lesson. President Biden had the courage to finally make the decision to say, no, we are not succeeding in this mission. Placing more American lives at risk will not change that. If we could credibly say, if we just stuck it out for another year, another 5, another 10, and got to a better result, that'd be a difficult call. Was that worth the risk? But we can't credibly say that. So we would have been putting American lives at risk for a mission that we had to know was not achievable. The president made the right call on that. There is the issue of how we withdrew. And I will say, and I've been critical of this, I think the effort to get the SIVs and the others who wanted to get out of Afghanistan certainly could have been handled better and could have been started sooner. It certainly seemed rushed, and I want to hear from our leaders today about how that played out. But again, let's remember that the other alternative was not easy. The alternative of let's start pulling people out sooner. The Ghani government, the government that was in charge of Afghanistan at the time we would have been doing this, was adamantly opposed to us pulling all of the military equipment and hundreds of thousands of their Afghan supporters out for obvious reasons. How would we have done that against the objection of the existing Afghan government while the Taliban were rolling across the countryside? It would not have been easy, no matter how it was done. But we do deserve an accounting for how those decisions were made forward. I think today is an excellent opportunity to do that. I look forward to the questions and answers as well as the testimony of our witnesses. And with that, I yield to the ranking member, Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And while I have great admiration for my friend, the chairman, I could not disagree more with his observations about Afghanistan and the president's decision. The fact is, our coalition partners and our military leadership felt that we should have maintained our 2,500 troops there, along with this roughly 7,500 to 8,000 coalition troops, and the thousands of contractors that the Afghan army was dependent upon to fight successfully. And I think they could have continued, as they have in past years, to fight valiantly had we given that support and the president had listened to his general's advice. But regardless of how you feel about the decision to remove troops from Afghanistan, I think we can all agree that the withdrawal was an unmitigated disaster. Hundreds of Americans were left behind, thousands of Afghan allies stuck with little hope of escape, potentially billions worth of U.S.-provided military equipment now in the hands of the Taliban, thousands of hardened al-Qaeda and ISIS terrorists freed from prisons, 10 innocent Afghans, including 7 children, killed in a botched airstrike. But worst of all, 13 brave Americans, service members, were murdered by a coward in a suicide vest. What's more infuriating is that all this could have been avoided if the president had a plan. In briefings and hearings since April, we've demanded to know a plan to A, safely evacuate Americans and Afghan allies, and B, conduct counterterrorism operations. For 4 months, the response from the Biden administration was, we're working on it. Now it's clear they never had a plan. The president repeatedly assured the American people that the Taliban takeover was not inevitable, that we had plenty of time to safely evacuate Americans and Afghan allies, that this was not going to be a fall like Saigon. As late as August 19th, the president promised us that if there's an American citizen left, we're going to stay to get them all out. Now it's clear the president has misled us more than once. On August 31st, hundreds of Americans left behind, the 13 service members murdered. The president stood in the East Room of the White House and called the withdrawal, quote, an extraordinary success, close quote. I fear the president is delusional. This wasn't an extraordinary success. It was an extraordinary disaster. It will go down in history as one of the greatest failures of American leadership. We're here today to get answers on how the hell this happened. I expect our witnesses to give us an honest accounting of exactly what went wrong. I also want answers on how we're going to conduct counterterrorism operations. This wasn't an extraordinary success. It was an extraordinary disaster. It will go down in history as one of the greatest failures of American leadership. We're here today to get answers on how the hell this happened. I expect our witnesses to give us an honest accounting of exactly what went wrong. I also want answers on how we're going to conduct counterterrorism operations now that we have zero presence in Afghanistan. This was the first question we asked you in April, and we still don't have an answer. According to the latest intelligence assessment, it could be as little as 12 months before al-Qaeda will use Afghanistan as a base to conduct airstrikes or strikes against the United States, and that's unacceptable. And this talk of over-the-horizon capability is a farce. Sure, we can send a drone out to take out a terrorist, but we didn't know where the terrorists are. Without persistent ISR capabilities or reliable intelligence on the ground, that's impossible. We have neither of those now. It doesn't help that we need to fly that drone nearly 1,600 miles to reach Afghanistan, leaving little time on station, or that we have to fly over Pakistan, an ally of the Taliban, who could revoke overflight privileges at any time. None of this is giving us much confidence that this administration can successfully conduct counterterrorism in Afghanistan. We want to know what capabilities we need, where they will be based, and how they'll be used. In other words, we want to see a plan, and we want to see it today. Because frankly, after this debacle of a withdrawal, I don't think anyone can trust anything this president says about Afghanistan. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Secretary, you are recognized.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Rogers, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss our recent drawdown and evacuation operations in Afghanistan. I'm pleased to be joined by Generals Milley and McKenzie, who I know will be able to provide you with additional context. I am incredibly proud of the men and women of the U.S. Armed Forces who conducted themselves with tremendous skill and professionalism throughout the war, the drawdown, and the evacuation. Over the course of our nation's longest war, 2,461 of our fellow Americans made the ultimate sacrifice, along with more than 20,000 who still bear the wounds of war, some of which cannot be seen on the outside. Now, we can discuss and debate the decisions, the policies, and the turning points since April of this year, when the President made clear his intent to end American involvement in this war. And we can debate the decisions over the last 20 years that led us to this point. But the one thing not open to debate is the courage and compassion of our service members, who, along with their families, served and sacrificed to ensure that our homeland would never again be attacked the way it was on September 11, 2001. I had the chance to speak with many of them during my trip to the Gulf region a few weeks ago, including the Marines who lost 11 of their teammates at the Abbey Gate in Kabul on the 26th of August. I've never been more humbled and inspired. They are rightfully proud of what they accomplished and the lives they saved in such a short period of time. The reason that our troops were able to get there so quickly is because we planned for just such a contingency. We began thinking about the possibilities for a non-combatant evacuation as far back as this spring. By late April, 2 weeks after the President's decision, military planners had crafted a number of evacuation scenarios. In mid-May, I ordered CENTCOM to make preparations for a potential non-combatant evacuation operation. And 2 weeks later, I began pre-positioning forces in the region to include 3 infantry battalions. On the 10th of August, we ran another tabletop exercise around a non-combatant evacuation scenario. We wanted to be ready, and we were. By the time that the State Department called for the NEO, significant numbers of additional forces had already arrived in Afghanistan, including leading elements of the 24th Marine Expeditionary Unit, who were already on the ground in Kabul. Before that weekend was out, another 3,000 or so ground troops had arrived, including elements of the 82nd Airborne. To be clear, those first 2 days were difficult. We all watched with alarm the images of Afghans rushing the runway in our aircraft. We all remember the scene of confusion outside.
Sorry, we'll get that under control. Go ahead, sir.
Outside the airport, but within 48 hours, our troops restored order and the process began to take hold. Our soldiers, airmen, and Marines, in partnership with our allies, our partners, and our State Department colleagues, secured the gates, took control of the airport operations, and set up a processing system for the tens of thousands of people that they would be manifesting onto airplanes. They and our commanders exceeded all expectations. We plan to evacuate between 70,000 and 80,000 people. They evacuated more than 124,000 people. We plan to move between 5,000 and 9,000 people per day, and on average, they move slightly more than 7,000 people per day. On military aircraft alone, we flew more than 387 sorties, averaging nearly 23 per day. And at the height of this operation, an aircraft was taking off every 45 minutes. And not a single sortie was missed for maintenance, fuel, or logistical problems. It was the largest airlift conducted in U.S. history, and it was executed in just 17 days. Was it perfect? Of course not. We moved so many people so quickly out of Kabul that we ran into capacity and screening problems at intermediate staging bases outside of Afghanistan. And we're still working to get Americans out who wish to leave. We did not get out all of our Afghan allies enrolled in a special immigrant visa program, and we take that seriously. And that's why we're working across the interagency to continue facilitating their departure, and even with no military presence on the ground, that part of our mission is not over. And tragically, lives were also lost. Several Afghans killed climbing aboard an aircraft on that first day. 13 brave U.S. service members and dozens of Afghan civilians killed in a terrorist attack on the 26th, and we took as many as 10 innocent lives in a drone strike on the 29th. Non-combatant evacuations remain among the most challenging military operations, even in the best of circumstances. And the circumstances in August were anything but ideal. Extreme heat, a landlocked country, no government, a highly dynamic situation on the ground, and an active, credible, and lethal terrorist threat. In the span of just 2 days, from August 13th to August 15th, we went from working alongside a democratically elected, long-term partner government to coordinating warily with a longtime enemy. We operated in a deeply dangerous environment, and it proved a lesson in pragmatism and professionalism. We also learned a lot of other lessons too, like about how to turn an Air Force base in Qatar to an international airport overnight, and about how to rapidly screen, process, and manifest large numbers of people. Nothing like this has ever been done before, and no other military in the world could have pulled it off. And I think that that's crucial. And I know that members of this committee will have questions on many things, such as why we turned over Bagram Airfield, and how real our over-the-horizon capability is, and why we didn't start evacuation sooner, and why we didn't stay longer to get more people out. So let me take each in turn. Retaining Bagram would have required putting as many as 5,000 U.S. troops in harm's way just to operate and defend it. And it would have contributed little to the mission that we had been assigned, and that was to protect and defend the embassy, which was some 30 miles away. And that distance from Kabul also rendered Bagram of little value in the evacuation. So staying at Bagram, even for counterterrorism purposes, meant staying at war in Afghanistan, something that the President made clear that he would not do. And as for over-the-horizon operations, when we use that term, we refer to assets and target analysis that come from outside the country in which the operation occurs. These are effective and fairly common operations. And just days ago, we conducted one such strike in Syria, eliminating a senior al-Qaeda figure. Over-the-horizon operations are difficult, but absolutely possible. And the intelligence that supports them comes from a variety of sources and not just U.S. boots on the ground. As for when we started evacuations, we offered input to the State Department's decision, mindful of their concerns that moving too soon might actually cause the very collapse of the Afghan government that we all wanted to avoid, and that moving too late would put our people and our operations at greater risk. As I said, the fact that our troops were on the ground so quickly is due in large part to our planning and pre-positioning of forces. As for the mission's end, my judgment remains that extending beyond the end of August would have greatly imperiled our people and our mission. The Taliban made clear that their cooperation would end on the 1st of September. And as you know, we faced grave and growing threats from ISIS-K. So staying longer than we did would have made it even more dangerous for our people and would not have significantly changed the number of evacuees we could get out. So as we consider these tactical issues today, we must also ask ourselves some equally tough questions about the wider war itself and pause to think about the lessons that we've learned over the past 20 years. Did we have the right strategy? Did we have too many strategies? Did we put too much faith in our ability to build effective Afghan institutions, an army, an air force, a police force, and government ministries? We helped build a state, but we could not forge a nation. The fact that the Afghan army that we and our partners trained simply melted away, in many cases without firing a shot, took us all by surprise, and it would be dishonest to claim otherwise. We need to consider some uncomfortable truths. That we did not fully comprehend the depth of corruption and poor leadership in their senior ranks. That we did not grasp the damaging effect of frequent and unexplained rotations by President Ghani of his commanders. That we did not anticipate the snowball effect caused by the deals that the Taliban commanders struck with local leaders in the wake of the Doha Agreement. That the Doha Agreement itself had a demoralizing effect on Afghan soldiers, and that we failed to fully grasp that there was only so much for which and for whom many of the Afghan forces would fight. We provided the Afghan military with equipment and aircraft and the skills to use them. And over the years, they often fought bravely, and tens of thousands of Afghan soldiers and police officers died. But in the end, we couldn't provide them with the will to win, at least not all of them. And as a veteran of that war, I am personally reckoning with all of that. But I hope, as I said at the outset, that we do not allow a debate about how this war ended to cloud our pride in the way that our people fought it. They prevented another 9/11. They showed extraordinary courage and compassion in the war's last days. They made lasting progress in Afghanistan that the Taliban will find difficult to reverse and that the international community should work hard to preserve. And now, our service members and civilians face a new mission, helping these Afghan evacuees move on to new lives and new places. And they are performing that one magnificently as well. And I spent some time with some of them up at Joint Base McGuire-Dix Lakehurst this past Monday. And I know that you share my profound gratitude and respect for their service, their courage, and professionalism, and I appreciate the support that this committee continues to provide them and their families. Thank you.
Chairman Milley.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Rogers, thank you for the opportunity to be here with Secretary Austin and General McKenzie to discuss Afghanistan. During the past 20 years, the men and women of the United States military, along with our allies and partners, fought the Taliban, brought Osama bin Laden to justice, denied al-Qaeda sanctuary, and protected our homeland for 2 consecutive decades. Over 800,000 of us in uniform served in Afghanistan. Most importantly, 2,461 U.S. soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines paid the ultimate price. 20,698 were wounded in action, and countless others suffered the invisible wounds of war. There's no doubt in my mind that our efforts prevented an attack on the homeland from Afghanistan, which was our core mission. And everyone who ever served in that war in Afghanistan should be proud your service mattered. Beginning in 2011, we steadily drew down our troop numbers, consolidated and closed bases, and retrograded equipment from Afghanistan. At our peak in 2011, we had 97,000 U.S. troops alongside 41,000 NATO troops in Afghanistan. 10 years later, when Ambassador Khalilzad signed the Doha Agreement with Mullah Beretta on 29 February 2020, the United States had 12,600 troops, with 8,000 NATO and 10,500 contractors in Afghanistan. This has been a 10-year, multi-administration drawdown, not a 19-month retrograde or a 17-day non-combatant evacuation operation. Under the Doha Agreement, the United States will begin to withdraw its forces contingent upon the Taliban meeting certain conditions, which would lead to a political agreement between the Taliban and the government of Afghanistan. There were 7 conditions applicable to the Taliban and 8 to the United States. While the Taliban did not attack the United States forces, which was one of the conditions, it failed to fully honor any other condition under the Doha Agreement. And perhaps most importantly for the United States national security, the Taliban has never renounced their linkages with al-Qaeda or broke their affiliation with them. We, the United States, adhered to every condition. In the fall of 2020, my analysis then was that an accelerated withdrawal without meeting specific and necessary conditions risks losing the substantial gains made in Afghanistan, would potentially damage U.S. worldwide credibility, and could precipitate a general collapse of the Afghan security forces and the Afghan government, resulting in a complete Taliban takeover or general civil war. That analysis was a year ago. Based on my advice and the advice of the commanders at the time, then Secretary of Defense Esper submitted a memorandum on 9 November, recommending that we maintain the U.S. forces, which were then at about 4,500 in Afghanistan, until conditions were met for further reductions. 2 days later, on 11 November, I received an unclassified signed order directing the United States military to withdraw all forces from Afghanistan by 15 January 2021. After further discussion regarding the risks associated with such a withdrawal, the order was rescinded. On 17 November, we received a new order to reduce troop levels to 2,500 plus enabling forces no later than 15 January. When President Biden was inaugurated, there were approximately 3,500 U.S. troops, 5,400 NATO, and 6,300 contractors in Afghanistan, tasked to train, advise, and assist a small contingent of counterterrorism forces. And the strategic situation was stalemate. The Biden administration, through the National Security Council process, conducted a rigorous interagency review of the situation in Afghanistan in February, March, and April. During this process, the views of all of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, all of us, the CENTCOM Commander, General McKenzie, U.S. 4A Commander General Miller, and myself were all given serious consideration by the administration. We provided a broad range of options in our assessment of their potential outcomes. We couched that in cost, benefit, risk to force, risk to mission. All of that was evaluated against the national security objectives of the United States. On 14 April, the President of the United States, President Biden, announced his decision, and the U.S. military received a change of mission to retrograde all U.S. military forces, maintain a small contingency force of 600 to 700 to protect the embassy in Kabul until the Department of State could coordinate contractor security support, and also to assist Turkey to maintain the Hamid Karzai International Airport and to transition the U.S. mission to over-the-horizon counterterrorism support and security force assistance. It is clear, it is obvious to all of us that the war in Afghanistan did not end on the terms that we wanted, with the Taliban now in power in Kabul. Although the NEO was unprecedented and is the largest air evacuation in history, it was a tactical, operational, and logistical success, evacuating 124,000 people. The war was a strategic failure. It came also at an incredible cost in the end, with 11 Marines, 1 soldier, and a Navy corpsman. These 13 gave their lives so that people they never met would have an opportunity to live in freedom. And we must remember that the Taliban was and remains a terrorist organization, and they still have not broken with al-Qaeda. I have no illusions who we are dealing with. It remains to be seen whether or not the Taliban can consolidate power or if the country will further fracture into civil war. But we must continue to protect the United States of America and its people from terrorist attacks from Afghanistan. A reconstituted al-Qaeda or ISIS with aspirations to attack the United States is a very real possibility. And those conditions, to include activity in ungoverned spaces, could present themselves in the next 12 to 36 months. That mission will be much harder now, but not impossible, and we will continue to protect the American people. Strategic decisions have strategic consequences. Over the course of 4 presidents, 12 secretaries of defense, 7 chairmen, 10 CENTCOM commanders, and 20 commanders in Afghanistan, and hundreds of congressional delegation visits and 20 years of congressional oversight, there are many lessons to be learned. Among those lessons is the unprecedented speed of the collapse of the ANSF. However, one lesson we can never forget is that every soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine who served there for 20 years protected our country against attack from terrorists. And for that, we all should be forever grateful, and those soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines should be forever proud. Mr. Chairman, with your permission, I'd like to address a couple of comments about my personal conduct that's been in the media lately.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, you may. Go ahead.
I've served this nation for 42 years. I've spent years in combat and buried a lot of my troops who died while defending this country. My loyalty to this nation, its people, and the Constitution hasn't changed and will never change as long as I have a breath to give. My loyalty to the Constitution and to this nation is absolute, and I will not turn my back on my fallen. With respect to the Chinese calls, I routinely communicated with my counterpart, General Lee, with the knowledge and coordination of civilian oversight. I am specifically directed to communicate with the Chinese by Department of Defense guidance in a document known as the Policy Dialogue System. These military-to-military communications at the highest levels are critical to the security of the United States in order to deconflict military actions, manage crisis, and prevent war between great powers armed with nuclear weapons. The calls on 30 October and 8 January were coordinated before and after with Secretary Esper and Acting Secretary Miller's staffs and the interagency. The specific purpose of the October and January calls was generated by concerning intelligence which caused us to believe the Chinese were worried about an attack by the United States. And last night I briefed that intelligence in detail to the Senate Armed Services Committee, and I'll be happy to brief it to any member or group of members at your discretion in a classified session. And I know, and I am certain, President Trump did not intend on attacking the Chinese, and it is my directed responsibility by the Secretary of Defense to convey that intent. My task at that time was to de-escalate. My message was, again, consistent: calm, steady, de-escalate. We're not going to attack you. At Secretary of Defense Esper's direction, I made a call to General Lee on 30 October. 8 people sat in that call with me, and I read out the call within 30 minutes of the call ending. On 31 December, the Chinese requested a call with me. The Department's Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asia-Pacific Policy helped coordinate my call, which was then scheduled for 8 January. And he made a preliminary call on 6 January. 11 people attended the call with me, and readouts of this call were distributed to the interagency that same day. On 14 December, then Acting Secretary of Defense Miller had been briefed on the entire program. Shortly after my call ended with General Lee, I informed both Secretary of State Pompeo and White House Chief of Staff Meadows about the call, among several other topics. Soon after that, I attended a meeting with Acting Secretary Miller, where I briefed him on the call. Later that same day, on 8 January, Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, called me to inquire about the President's ability to launch nuclear weapons. I sought to assure her that nuclear launch is governed by a very specific and deliberate process. She was concerned and made various personal references characterizing the President. I explained to her that the President is the sole nuclear launch authority, but he doesn't launch them alone, and that I am not qualified to determine the mental health of the President of the United States. There are processes, protocols, and procedures in place and I repeatedly assured her there is no chance of an illegal, unauthorized, or accidental launch of nuclear weapons. The Presidential Directive and SecDef directives, the Chairman is part of this process to ensure that the President is fully informed when determining the use of the world's deadliest weapons. By law, I am not in the chain of command, and I know that. However, by Presidential Directive and Department of Defense instruction, signed by the President and Secretaries of Defense, I am in the chain of communication to fulfill my legal statutory role as the President's primary military advisor. After the Speaker Pelosi call, I convened a short meeting in my office with key members of my staff to refresh all of us on these procedures, which we practice 3 times a day at the action officer level. Additionally, I immediately informed Acting Secretary of Defense Miller of her call. At no time was I attempting to change or influence the process, usurp authority, or insert myself into the chain of command. But I am expected to give my advice and ensure the President is fully informed on military affairs. I am submitting for the record, and I believe you have it, a couple of memorandums for record, in addition to detailed timelines, and I am happy to discuss in further detail in either classified or unclassified sessions with any or all of you about my actions surrounding these events. I welcome a thorough walkthrough. I'll be happy to provide whatever documents, phone logs, emails, memoranda, witnesses, or anything else you want that will help you understand these events. My oath is to support the Constitution of the United States of America against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and I will never turn my back on that oath. I firmly believe in civilian control of the military as a bedrock principle and essential to the health of this republic, and I'm committed to ensuring the military stays clear of domestic politics. Thank you, Chairman, for the extra time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Excuse me. General McKenzie.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Rogers, distinguished members of the committee, thanks for the opportunity to testify about recent events in Afghanistan. As the theater commander, I will confine my opening remarks to those matters that were under my direct operational control, specifically the withdrawal of U.S. forces and the subsequent non-combatant evacuation operation. These were 2 distinct combat missions, both conducted in contact with the enemy. We had a plan for each of them. We executed those plans. And thanks to the valor and dedication of thousands of men and women in harm's way, we completed both missions, fulfilling the President's order to withdraw all U.S. forces and evacuating over 124,000 non-combatants from Afghanistan. I last appeared before this body only days after President Biden announced his decision to withdraw all U.S. forces from that country, and my testimony regarding that decision is already a matter of public record. I'll only reiterate that I had an opportunity to offer my professional advice to the President through the Secretary, and I am confident that he weighed it carefully. That's all any commander can ask. Once the President made his decision, my headquarters and that of U.S. Forces Afghanistan under General Scott Miller made the withdrawal of our forces our top priority. We did this in close coordination with our allies and partners. Every departure of every element was carefully synchronized across the coalition and with our Afghan partners. On no occasion were they caught unaware by our movements. Every base was handed off to Afghan forces according to a mutually understood plan. This is particularly true of Bagram Airfield. Many of you have visited Bagram at some point over the past 20 years and were probably struck by 2 of its defining features: its sprawling size and its isolation. Virtues for most of its lifespan, they rendered it untenable under the circumstances. The guidance I received in April was to conduct the complete withdrawal of U.S. combat forces and plan for a diplomatic security force of absolutely no more than 650 service members. It was not feasible to preserve the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, hold and defend Hamid Karzai International Airport, the embassy's key link to the outside world, and also defend Bagram Airfield with 650 soldiers and Marines. This is important. The Bagram option went away when we were ordered to reduce our presence to the 650 personnel in Kabul. I'd like to shift briefly to the NEO, which, as I have noted, was a completely different operation than the withdrawal. They were separate. The withdrawal began in April following the President's direction. The decision to conduct a NEO rested with the Department of State, and they made that decision on 14 August. In our NEO planning, Central Command assumed that we would have to bring out a very large number of people. We did not regard the size of a potential NEO as overwhelming or too much to accomplish. We did not regard a Taliban takeover as inevitable, but neither did we rule it out. And we identified critical indicators of an impending collapse of the Afghan National Defense Forces. We crafted branches to our base plan to account for a complete collapse of the Afghan security forces. The Secretary took action in May to make forces available to me for planning. On July the 9th, I requested that our base NEO force, the core package that would go in, be put on 96-hour prepare to deploy orders. By August 11th, it was evident to me that Kabul was at risk, and I requested the deployment of a brigade of the 82nd Airborne Division and other elements of our own alert pre-planned force package. And I requested that they be deployed into HKIA, Hamid Karzai International Airfield. These forces flowed swiftly into theater, even as the Afghan National Defense Forces disintegrated, allowing thousands of civilians access to the airfield. Working with Afghan partners composed of elite commando units who did not fall apart, and our arriving NEO forces, on August the 16th, we cleared the airfield and resumed flight operations in a matter of hours. With security reestablished by a force ultimately comprising 5,784 U.S. troops, 8 maneuver battalions, and hundreds of coalition forces, operations continued without interruption until our final flights. By that time, we evacuated over 124,000 people from Afghanistan. This was a difficult mission, made possible by the exceptional professionalism and valor of the joint force on the ground in Afghanistan and across the entire world. I would specifically like to use this opportunity to thank the C-17 crews of the Air Mobility Command for a feat rivaling and exceeding, in fact, the Berlin airlift. Moments after the last of the final 5 C-17s lifted off from HKIA, I held a briefing with the Pentagon press corps and expressed my gratitude and admiration for the forces who carried out this NEO. I also provided various figures that conveyed the magnitude of their accomplishment. I won't reiterate those figures here and now, but I will say that after the passage of nearly a month, my pride in their accomplishment remains undiminished. I don't need to tell this body that on 26 August, 11 Marines, 1 sailor, and 1 soldier made the ultimate sacrifice on behalf of their country. We will never forget them. This was a combat operation of the most difficult sort, a non-combatant evacuation carried out in contact with the enemy. The enemy in this case was ISIS Khorasan, a vile, tenacious foe that would undoubtedly have killed many, many more Americans and innocent Afghans at HKIA if it were not for the vigilance of our forces there. On 29 August, we undertook an MQ-9 strike against what we thought was an imminent threat to HKIA. That strike was a mistake, and I take full responsibility for that strike. I was under no pressure from any quarter to conduct the strike. It was based on our intelligence read of the situation on the ground. While in many cases we were right with our intelligence and forestalled ISIS-K attacks, in this case we were wrong, tragically wrong. I appreciate that there are many other topics of interest to this committee, and I look forward to answering your questions on all of them. I'll close here by reiterating my profound gratitude and appreciation for every soldier, sailor, Marine, airman, and guardian, as well as our intelligence and Department of Defense and Department of State comrades who contributed to each of these difficult missions. I remain humbled by their sense of duty and courage. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Secretary, I want to drill down a little bit on the keeping 2,500 troops there. And I'm struck as I listen to the comments that I think the real problem here is you have to make decisions in the real world. You don't get to imagine an outcome that would make it more palatable. And I think that's what really factored into the 2,500. And as we talk about the 13 service members who died and attacked the leadership here for not having prevented that, how you can do that and then advocate that we should have stayed in Afghanistan longer so that more service members, I guess the only way you can advocate that is to imagine a scenario whereby we could have stayed in a chaotic war zone, not had soldiers get killed, not have made any mistakes. You know, how you can not make mistakes in that chaotic environment, I don't know. And every member serving on this committee has been in those environments in one way or another. So you don't have the luxury of waving a magic wand and making all the problems go away and simply making a decision where nothing goes wrong. And it's really frustrating to hear people advocate that we should stay and still decry what happened. Do you think fighting in a war zone, there wouldn't be similar mistakes if we had stayed there for another 5 or 10 years, more civilians killed accidentally, more U.S. service members dead in exactly the same way that we just saw? Sorry, that's very frustrating. But could you talk to us a little bit about the 2,500 service members who could have been left there, and how you approached that decision, and what exactly, well, not what exactly your advice was to the president for what I said earlier, but how you approached that decision and how you attempt to deal with that while advising the president.
Well, first of all, Chairman, let me be clear that I support the president's decision to end the war in Afghanistan. I did not support staying in Afghanistan forever. And let me also say, we've talked about the process that we use to provide input to the president. I think that process was a very thorough and inclusive policy process, and the recommendations of the commanders were taken into consideration, discussed, and deliberated on throughout that process. As you indicated, I will always keep my recommendations to the president confidential, but I would say that in my view, there was no risk-free status quo option. I think that the Taliban had been clear that if we stayed there longer, they were going to recommence attacks on our forces. I think while it's conceivable that you could stay there, my view is that you would have had to deploy more forces in order to protect ourselves and accomplish any missions that we would have been assigned. It's also my view, Mr. Chairman, that the best way to end this war was through a negotiated settlement, and sadly, that did not happen.
Thank you. And let me just also say that I know there are members of this committee who think we should have stayed, who are honest about that advocation. I think of Congressman Waltz, who has been very honest about the fact, both under President Trump and under President Biden, that we should have stayed. He's very honest about the fact that there were costs and risks and lives would have been lost. That's the type of discussion that we need to have. But to jump down the president's throat because he actually had to make the decision in an impossible situation, I think does a grave disservice to this committee's ability to do effective and honest, nonpartisan oversight. Costs were going to be borne here. There was no easy option. And I do hope that people will remember that as we go through the questions and answers that will proceed. With that, I yield to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Milley, was the DOD in charge of making decisions about troop strength in this withdrawal, or were you in a support role?
Let me put it this way. You talking about the NEO, or what
I'm
part of the
talking
mission
about,
that
well, let me just go back even further.
Okay.
In January of this year, were you of the opinion, in your professional military judgment, that we should have maintained 2,500 troops, U.S. troops, in support of the coalition effort and contractors in Afghanistan?
Yeah, my assessment that I read in the opening statement remained consistent. Did
that professional military opinion change over the course of the next few months?
Not until presidential decision, and I rendered my opinions, and there was a fulsome debate on all of that. And once decisions are made, then I'm expected to execute lawful orders.
And you've made that very clear. So my question is, when the troop levels were ordered to be drawn down to 0 and first stopping at 650, as General McKenzie outlined, was that your decision or General McKenzie's decision to draw down to 650?
It was a task and then a troop-to-task analysis, with the task being to go to 0, but you also have to defend the embassy. So
I'm thinking about the chain of command. Somebody's making decisions about troop levels, and my understanding is it was not the DOD. It was the State Department or the White House. I want to know who said we're going to go from 2,500 to 650 and just protect Kabul and the State Department.
It was a military analysis that 600 to 700 could adequately defend the embassy until contractors come up, and that was then approved up through the chain and approved at the highest levels.
Who made the decision?
I would say that that decision was made in a national security consultative process by the highest levels of our government.
General McKenzie, did you receive advice from General Miller in the end of 20 and early 21 related to troop levels in Afghanistan?
Ranking Member, I did.
What was that advice?
The advice, his view and my view were essentially the same view. And my view was that we needed to maintain about 2,500 and that we also needed to work with our coalition partners who had about 6,000 troops in there, NATO and other core countries that would remain there.
Did your professional military opinion change over the course of the spring?
It did not.
Did you communicate? Well, I know you communicated to the President. You said you did. Were you present in the room when General Miller's recommendations were relayed to the President?
Without going, General Miller was present in executive sessions that involved myself, the Secretary here, the Chairman, and the President.
And those recommendations of the parties, as Secretary Austin said, were debated fully in that meeting.
They were debated fully. I felt that my opinion was heard with great thoughtfulness by the President.
Well, you know, Secretary Austin just made the point that there was a fulsome debate of the pros and cons and the costs and risks. Yet, in August of this year, President Biden told George Stephanopoulos in an interview, no one said that to me, referring to keeping some 2,500 troops in Afghanistan. Was that an inaccurate statement by the President?
Sir, I am not going to comment on a statement by the President.
Okay. General McKenzie, in mid-June, your commanders on the ground were informing you that things were deteriorating. As you testified a little while ago, at that time, in your judgment, you should stop withdrawal and increase forces and or proceed with the retrograde. What did you decide at that time?
We decided to proceed with the retrograde.
Okay. Was were you ordered to do that by the President?
We followed our original we had original orders. We followed those orders through to completion.
Was it the President's orders?
My orders come from the Secretary of Defense through to the President. So it's a very short chain of command for me.
Okay. Secretary Austin, on the 23rd, you told this committee that you had developed a very detailed plan to conduct safe, orderly, and responsible withdrawal, and were executing that plan. On August 18th, the President said, quote, "The idea that somehow there was going to be a way that we could have gotten out with chaos ensuing, I don't know how that happens," close quote. How do you reconcile those discrepancies between what you assured the Congress and what the President's telling us?
Thank you, sir. First of all, in terms of the withdrawal of our troops and the retrograde of equipment, that plan, as developed by General Miller and General McKenzie, was executed as planned, and all of our equipment was retrograded, and we drew down the force that we wanted to draw down to that very small force that you saw at the embassy at the very end there. The chaos that ensued followed the collapse of the military and the collapse of the government. And when those two things happen, then it was going to be a chaotic situation.
And the collapse of the government and the collapse of the military was solely the responsibility of this administration. I know y'all are trying to be careful politically, but it was the State Department and the White House that told you how to make those drawdown of troops from 2,500 to 650 to 0. It was the speed with which they done it, that they carried out that order. That's what caused the chaos that we have. If they'd allowed the DOD to be in a command situation, we wouldn't have had this problem. General McKenzie's testified that the only reason he couldn't keep Bagram was because he had to draw down to 650 troops, and his primary orders were to keep Hamid Karzai and the State Department safe. We just have to admit this was the State Department and the White House that caused this catastrophe, not the Defense Department. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Lancher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, and I want to thank our witnesses for your testimony today and for your service to our nation. My constituents and I have obviously a lot of questions about the planning that led up to this, and I'll admit that I'm concerned that based on the conditions on the ground, General Milley and General McKenzie recommended against final withdrawal. I wish the administration had been more thoughtful and not had rushed this. I've yet to hear the answer to the question, though, of why did we not start withdrawing American citizens and SIVs sooner? We knew we were going to be withdrawing, whether we started doing that withdrawal of the Americans and SIVs in January or May or sooner than the actual execution of the order to withdraw. I'd like that question answered. Also, Secretary Austin, given the general's concerns, were the discussions about pushing the withdrawal back to spring of 2022 or conditioning it on the criteria in the Doha agreement to ensure that we did the handoff correctly? We already weren't going to fully withdraw by May 2021. And Secretary Austin, what was the military rationale of leaving by the end of August when the Taliban are at their strongest in the fighting season, as opposed to waiting in the the winter months when there's more of a lull in the Taliban fighting season, where it's a relatively low level of activity and they're at their weakest? I'd just stop with those questions.
And I'm sorry, before you get into I'm going to stick to the 5-minute rule. So when the clock hits 0, we're going to move on to other people. Go ahead.
Thank you, sir. On the issue of why we didn't bring out civilians and SIVs sooner, again, the call on how to do that and when to do it is really a State Department call. We provided input, as I said in my opening statement, to the State Department. Their concerns, rightfully, were that, number one, they were being cautioned by the Ghani administration that if they withdrew American citizens and SIV applicants at a pace that was too fast, it would cause a collapse of the government that we were trying to prevent. And so I think that went into the calculus. And when you add into also into the calculus that the SIV process was at that point, very slow, deliberate, and not very responsive, with your help, we were able to curtail the time that it took to work through that process. But a number of things kind of came together to cause what happened to happen. But again, we provided our input, and we certainly would have liked to seen it go faster or sooner. But again, they had a number of things to think through as well. In terms of adjusting, or why the president chose to leave in the summer versus waiting until the next year, obviously a number of things went into his decision calculus. But as we came on board, the agreement that had been made was that we were going to depart by May 1. We were able to work to get more time to ensure that we could conduct a deliberate and safe and orderly retrograde. But again, the president made the decision that we would leave in the summer versus going into the next year. So, and I'll leave it at that, sir, pending any more questions.
Secretary, I want to know how we now protect the country going forward. Former CIA Director and Secretary of Defense Panetta said that our national security is threatened by the Taliban takeover. One of our missions was to prevent a haven for terrorist groups, and I quote, "We have failed in that mission," end quote. Similarly, the director of the DIA has assessed that al-Qaeda could threaten the homeland in 1 to 2 years. So I agree that over-the-horizon operations can be effective. However, I'm concerned that without complementary operations, they will be insufficient to keep us safe. Secretary Austin, are you confident that over-the-horizon capabilities on their own can mitigate the terrorist threat we face? Are you confident that we can prevent Afghanistan from becoming a haven? And how will you keep our country safe?
And I apologize, but the gentleman's time has expired, so that question will have to go unanswered.
I'd like that for the record.
Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In an interview on August 16th, President Biden promised to keep military troops in Afghanistan until every American citizen who wanted to leave was able to leave. This did not happen, nor can we confirm the Blinken claim that he sent 19 separate messages to Americans telling them to leave the country since March of this year. Also unclear is the truth of the Biden claim that no military commander recommended leaving behind a residual force, even though all of you, starting courageously with General Scott Miller, have now made it clear that your professional military advice was to do so. On August 26, I formally requested all letters referenced that day by Biden from military commanders advising him on the Afghanistan withdrawal. To date, I haven't received a response. As a 31-year Army veteran myself, grateful to have 4 sons who have served in Iraq, Egypt, the southern border, and Afghanistan, I was immediately skeptical letters existed. President Biden left behind thousands of American citizens, green card holders, brave interpreters, and Afghan media reporters who worked with the United States. Biden was correct when he said the buck stops with him as the person responsible for Afghanistan, as well as for the terrorists that are now crossing the southern border to plan attacks on American neighborhoods. In addition to betraying the American citizens and the U.S. allies in Afghanistan, the Biden decision to have a premature withdrawal left the people of Afghanistan, who had 60,000 troops killed by the Taliban, under the complete control of the Taliban, a barbaric terrorist organization, as General Milley has confirmed, with al-Qaeda. Again, Biden was correct. The buck stops with him. The war has moved from Afghanistan to American neighborhoods, equally endangering our allies of India and Israel. Mr. Secretary, even before the withdrawal, there were frustrating reports of Americans and green card holders being turned away at the gates of the airport or being instructed by the administration to stay away from the airport entirely. While other countries were sending their special forces into Kabul to retrieve their citizens and bring them to the airport, you repeatedly refused to do the same, even after promising in a Pentagon press conference on August 18 that, quote, we're going to get everyone we can possibly to evacuate, and I'll do that as long as we possibly can until the clock runs out or if we run out of capability, end of quote. Mr. Secretary, the American public needs to know, did the clock run out or did you run out of capability? Did you at any point ask President Biden for any more time or more support to enable your forces to stay and complete the full evacuations of American citizens, not leaving them behind as promised? If so, what was the Biden response?
First of all, sir, thank you for your personal service in our military, and thanks for the service of your family members. We remain grateful. On the issue of evacuating American citizens and SIV holders or SIV applicants, this work continues on. We're not finished, and we'll make sure that that we stay focused on this to get out every American citizen that wants to leave and has the right credentials to be able to leave. On the issue of the security at the airport, it was my assessment, and I remain convinced of this, that the risk to mission and risk to force was beyond significant. And had we stayed there much longer, we would have endured continued attacks by ISIS-K and potentially the Taliban. And you know, as each day went forward, as that risk increased, you know, we stood to have aircraft shot down. We stood to have people injured additional people injured on the airfield. And so as we weighed those risks.
Mr. Secretary, I need to have this completed. And in fact, I'll be sending you questions for the record. And I really want to know how many Americans have been left behind. And so we'll get that, but I will be providing questions for the record. But I sadly believe that American families today are at a greater risk of murderous attacks at home than ever before. You talked about the attacks at the airport. No, they're coming here. And that is that in history, we are at greater risk. Suicide bombers can operate from the safe haven of Afghanistan, just as 9/11, and with the open southern borders. The example of May 8th, mass murder of over 80 girls in Kabul should have not been forgotten. The buck stops with 13 murdered Marines. Mr. Biden is disregarding the military advice, and I believe the President should resign. I yield back.
I'm prepared to begin my questions, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Larson is recognized for 5 minutes.
Heads up, I don't have a speech, so I'm launching into my questions right now, so get ready to answer them. With regards, General Milley, with regards to the November 11th unsigned, unclassified signed order, whose signature was on that order?
Former President Trump.
Okay, and then 6 days later, that was rescinded after
Correct.
discussion. Is that correct?
Correct.
And were the what were the top three concerns with that particular order?
Well, the instruction had two lines. Line one was withdraw all U.S. military forces from Somalia by 31 December. Second sentence was withdraw all U.S. military forces from Afghanistan by 15 January. So I went over and spoke to the White House, had some conversations with some folks, not the president.
Sure.
And we discussed the cost, risk, benefit, et cetera, and the feasibility, acceptability, and suitability of that order.
Okay. All right.
It was subsequently rescinded.
Was that the first time? Well, I'll ask Secretary Austin. In the last 20 years, given the history in Afghanistan, is that the first order at all that's come out asking for a withdrawal? Did we have withdrawal plans or withdrawal orders at all in the last 20 years from Afghanistan?
Absolutely. As you know, we increased our footprint in Afghanistan over time, and then we
and shrunk it, but not
a complete withdrawal.
Not complete withdrawal. Yeah. That's different. I'm talking about zero.
Right.
Down to
right.
zero. So, and was this would be the first time then? This November 11th order would have been the first ask for a withdrawal to zero?
That's correct.
To your knowledge?
To my knowledge.
Within the DoD, okay. From the president or anything? Got it. From any president, I should say. Thank you. Just trying to get timeline set. And this relates to General McKenzie. You talked about the 2,500, the recommendation, the discussion you had about 2,500 troops. Was that for a particular set of missions, and did those missions change? Therefore, that 2,500 became 650, became zero?
So when we looked at the 2,500 number, we were looking at a force that would have the ability to do very limited advise assist at a high level, assist in logistics management for the Afghans, but it would have been functioning at a very high level. So that was the force that we wanted to continue to keep on the ground. As we went down to, as we looked at going down to 650, you get a force that is almost exclusively built around the ability to defend the embassy and the airfield and provide entry-level logistics to the Afghans. By that, I mean a package comes into the airport, you give it over to the Afghans, they drive it away, and you have no way to track what happened.
Yeah.
We lost that capability.
Yeah,
when we
but,
went down.
but based on the civilian leadership saying this is what the civilian leadership wants to do. Now you get to, and I know you're not arguing this point. You make the recommendations, giving your best advice, and then civilian leadership has the opportunity to say thank you, but here's what I would rather be doing.
That's absolutely correct.
So the mission changed.
The mission fundamentally changed when if going to zero means you're going to reduce all your capability to do any kind of real on-the-ground work, even at a truncated level with the Afghan forces. You're going to be talking at the ministerial level, at the very highest levels of government only, and you're not going to have any real visibility about what's going on the ground.
Yeah, General Milley, did you want to try to address that?
I did. I just wanted to clarify one thing. The 11 November order is actually not the first one. The first one's the Doha Agreement, which directs going to zero by 1 May. The 11 November order is an accelerated withdrawal to bring it to zero by 15 January. So two different instructions.
That's great. Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate that. I'll just, for the record, I'll ask this question because then this gets to kind of follow on to all of this. How do you define over-the-horizon capabilities, and like what are those specifically? And how do we execute those? And we're going to explore that a little bit more probably here today.
Sir, I'll be prepared.
We have 15 seconds. So
I'll be prepared to talk a little bit about it today, but I think more importantly, I'll be prepared to come over at the direction of the Secretary and provide a classified briefing.
I think it'd be very helpful, and there may be an opportunity in the future to travel to the region and hear directly what it looks like on the ground.
With the Chairman's permission, sir, I would offer that briefing by General McKenzie, along with joint staff representation and my policy people as well.
Yeah, we will definitely be following up on that. I mean, the issue of what we do going forward to deal with the counterterrorism threat out of South Asia is something this committee has already looked at and will continue to look at for a very long time. Mr. Turner is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I serve on both the House Armed Services Committee and the Intelligence Committee. The Intelligence Committee has already been briefed from the intelligence community concerning their participation of the August 29th drone attack. General McKenzie, you've taken in front of us full responsibility for that. I have a series of information that I would like released to this committee so that we can adequately provide oversight to what occurred on August 29th. What we know from your prior statements is that you did not know who it was who was in the car, whose house it was, or who or how many people were in the house. This greatly concerns me as we look to the over-horizon claims that the administration has of its ability for counterterrorism. You did not, as your goal was stated, thwart or disrupt an imminent attack. You killed an innocent man, and yet an attack didn't happen. So there are serious questions concerning both the information that you had and the manner in which the execution occurred. So I would request that it be released to this committee and the Intelligence Committee, relevant video excerpts from the drones of August 29th, the protocols that were in place prior to this drone attack mission, the intelligence that an attack was imminent against our